Mr. Chairman, please allow me to thank His Excellency, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and you as Chair of the Committee on Migrant Workers for the invitation to make this brief intervention, a request which brings great honor to the Observer Mission of the Holy See and to Caritas Internationalis, both of which I serve here in Geneva. The convention on which we focus today resulted from a multi-year process. In 1972, ECOSOC expressed alarm at the unauthorized transportation of laborers to some European countries and at the exploitation of workers from some African countries, I quote, in conditions akin to slavery and forced labor, end of quote. In the same year, the UN General Assembly condemned discrimination against foreign workers and called upon governments to end such practices and to improve reception arrangements for migrant workers. In 1976, following a request from ECOSOC, the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities adopted a report on the exploitation of labor through illicit and clandestine trafficking. The report recommended that the United Nations adopt a convention on the rights of migrant workers. In 1978, this recommendation was echoed at the World Conference to Combat Racism and Racial Discrimination, and in the UN General Assembly Resolution 33/163. Subsequently, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution to convene a working group open to all member states and to draft a convention. Several international structures and agencies were invited to contribute to the achievement of this task. Reconstituted at successive annual sessions of the General Assembly, the working group finished drafting the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families in 1990. It seems unnecessary to note that the convention entered into force in 2003. Perhaps it is not as widely known, however, that between 1990 and 1998, only 9 states had ratified the convention, and that between 1998 and 2004, another 18 states did so. Thus, in 1998, the Steering Committee of the Global Campaign for Ratification of the Convention was first convened. It is a unique alliance involving United Nations Secretariat, intergovernmental agencies, and leading international human rights, religious, labor, migrant, and women's organizations. If I may take the liberty to share a personal opinion about this matter, I believe that the additional contribution of civil society organizations was the key to success, both during the articulation of the document and even more importantly, during the subsequent campaign to promote and secure additional ratifications. Either as migrants themselves or as those working at grassroots levels with migrants and their families, these non-state actors have firsthand knowledge of the humiliating rejection and stigmatization endured by many migrants, of the oppressive and unjust work conditions often imposed on them, and of the life-threatening risks presented by many unscrupulous human traffickers and unjust employers. In 2005, UNESCO noted, I quote, "Several states are reluctant to ratify the convention because they consider that it gives too many rights to migrants," end of quote, and further maintain that the convention does not propose any new sets of rights that would be specific to migrants. States that already respect human rights and that have ratified other human rights instruments therefore have no reason to resist ratifying the convention. In this regard, at the recent Quadrennial General Assembly held in May 2015, the 165 national member organizations of Caritas Internationalis, present in every region of the world, committed themselves to achieve the strategic outcome that, I quote, "more national policies concerning migrants enable safe and lawful migration, include the needs and protection of children, promote the unity and integrity of the migrant family, and contribute to the perception of migrants as contributors to society and development, end of quote. The Caritas members also promised to engage even more vigorously in the campaign to promote additional ratifications of the convention. The prophetic vision of this convention is beyond any shadow of doubt. Its various articles, inter alia, offer comprehensive definitions for migrant workers and their respective families, emphasize the principle of non-discrimination, grant a fairly broad series of rights to all migrant workers and members of their families, irrespective of their migratory status, require that they shall not be subjected to arbitrary arrest or detention or measures of collective expulsion, specify that they should enjoy decent and equitable working and living conditions, access to health care, education, and other fundamental economic, social, and cultural rights. The Convention also insists on sound, equitable, and humane conditions for international migration, including protection of migrants from abuse and adoption of measures to prevent and eliminating trafficking in persons, promotion of safe, dignified, and legal pathways to employment, facilitation of family reunification, upholding the rights of migrant children, and protection of the unity of the family. No amount of visionary thought and planning, however, could have anticipated the complex and exacerbating migration-related issues and challenges more recently being faced on a daily basis. In 2002, the Secretary General of the United Nations noted in his report to the General Assembly, I quote, "It is time to take a more comprehensive look at the various dimensions of the migration issue. We need to understand better the causes of international flows of people and their complex interrelationship with development," end of quote. In her address to the 2010 convening of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights declared, I quote, "We also need to be mindful that migrants are often vulnerable to discrimination, intolerance, xenophobia, and racism. Irregular migrants are particularly exposed to abuse, such as denial of access to basic health care, adequate housing, sexual harassment, violence, or worse. Such discriminatory practices are breaches of international law. They must not be allowed to continue," end of quote. In 2012, the Committee on the Rights of the Child expressed grave concerns about the increasing tendency to detain children who were found to be in irregular migratory status, maintained that the detention of children because of their or their parents' migration status constitutes a child's rights violation, and recommended that states should adopt alternatives to detention that fulfill the best interests of the child, along with their rights to liberty and family life. On the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the Convention, your own Committee on Migrant Workers noted with much regret, I quote, "State obligations to protect migrant workers are often unfulfilled, due partly to continued emphasis by governments and political actors on the immigration status of migrant workers, rather than on the human rights of migrant workers and members of their families," end of quote. In his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis aptly captured the constantly worsening situation experienced by many migrants today. I quote, "Large numbers of people are leaving their homelands with a suitcase full of fears and desires to undertake a hopeful and dangerous trip in search of more humane living conditions," end of quote. He sadly noted that, I quote, "Often, however, such migration gives rise to suspicion and hostility, and prior to any knowledge of the migrants' lives or series of persecution and destitution," end of quote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.